This day in 1921 was Warriors' Day, and Vi Loraine, the great musical comedy star, was getting the crowd into the theatre for a benefit performance for ex-servicemen. They'd returned from World War I to what they'd been told would be a land fit for heroes to live in, but it hadn't worked out like that. And famous stars like Bobby Howes and Leslie Henson organised this show to help them. In the years before World War I, the great figure in the British boxing world was Bombardier Billy Wells, who won the British heavyweight title in 1911 when he knocked out Iron Haig in the 6th round of the championship fight in London. But on this day in 1919, the Bombardier was in training for the fight with Joe Beckett, which was to lose him his title. And Joe Beckett, in turn, was to be beaten soon afterwards by that wonderful French boxer, Georges Carpentier. The greatest batsman cricket has ever known is Sir Don Bradman, who dominated the game with his double and treble centuries for 20 years. These pictures are of the Australians versus Worcestershire match in 1948, the opening game of Bradman's last tour of this country. His first had been 18 years earlier in 1930, when as a young man of 22, who only a few years before had been a farm lad at Bowral near Sydney, he made the record test score of 334 in the third test match at Leeds. When he scored his 288th run, which topped R.E. Foster's previous record, the crowd raised such an uproar that play had to be stopped until it died down. And then in the same season, Bradman went on to make 254 at Lord's and 232 in the final match at the Oval. 334 was the highest score Don Bradman was ever to make, but he went near to equaling it 4 years later with 304, also at Leeds, and his single and double centuries became almost commonplace. In fact, his remarkable scoring so upset the normal balance of cricket that D.R. Jardine introduced the bodyline bowling that was to cause such an outcry in Australia in 1932-33. In this match in 1948 at Worcester, Bradman only scored a modest single century, but it led his team to an innings victory. The Petrol horse car, 1920. This must have been one of the very first demonstrations of stunting with a car, racing up the ramp and leaping a hurdle in the style to become popular with the daredevil stuntmen of the later 20s and 30s. By this day, in 1927, parking the car had already become a problem all over the world. In France, a new type of front wheel was tried out, which would enable cars to turn round in their own length. The wheels turned sideways, and the car slipped into place without maneuvering, and out again just as easily. We've not discovered what happened to this idea, but it looks like one worth reinvestigating. At about the same time, in the late 20s, Mussolini was already a political personality, and several people had already considered him worthy of attempted assassination. One misfired shot had damaged his nose. Visiting the Italian colony of Tripoli, he already foresaw the time when he would launch his grandiose schemes for a second Roman Empire. "We dream," he said, "of a Roman Italy, disciplined and imperial." And perhaps as he looked at these ruins, he thought of the other ruin he desired. "I want to see a panorama of ruins about me, the ruins of all other political forces, so that fascism may stand alone, gigantic and dominant." But he couldn't have seen into the grim future that he himself contrived for the bridegroom when he attended the marriage of his daughter Edda to Count Ciano. Ciano had been with Mussolini since the early days of fascism, and as Minister of Communications took full advantage of the excellent opportunities the post gave him for enriching himself. As the husband of Il Duce's daughter, he advanced rapidly, achieving the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs at the age of 33. For 10 years, he was to be the supreme confidant of his father-in-law, until the day when Mussolini himself arranged for a sham tribunal to pass sentence of death on Count Ciano. And in contrast to the warmonger, the pacifist Ramsay MacDonald with his daughter Ishbel with President Roosevelt in 1933. First Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald was a master of obscure, meandering and meaningless oratory. The joint statement at the end of these American conferences to discuss problems of the coming World Economic Conference is typically vague. The purpose of exploring the problems had been admirably served. In the same year, a Romany queen died. 82-year-old Gypsy Rose Lee, famous for her prophecies of the future. The old Queen of the Gypsies had forecast her own death accurately, and she was given a royal funeral. Gypsies from all over Britain came to pay a last homage to Gypsy Rose Lee and to swell the long procession that followed her coffin. This day in 1941, and for the first time in history, women register for national service. The first call-up was for girls born in 1920, and before the day was over, some 300,000 had registered. If you were not already engaged on work of national importance, then you were needed for the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force, or for the Land Army, nursing, munitions, and other services. In the First World War, women voluntarily worked for victory and earned their right to vote on equal terms with men. In the Second World War, they were treated like the men as conscripts who must do their duty. Just before this day in 1945, Germany was cut in half at last. The 5th Ukrainian Army had been advancing towards the Elbe from the east, and the 1st American Army, after the fall of Leipzig, had been rapidly heading towards the long-awaited meeting. It came about at last in the town of Torgau on the banks of the Elbe. For some time, the Americans had been in touch with the advanced armored units of the Red Army by shortwave radio. Then 2 patrols met to the east of the river. And when the main meeting took place and GIs and Russian soldiers saw each other at last, they threw their arms round each other's shoulders and drank toasts to each other. It was a meeting of the 2 army commanders too, General Hodges of the 1st American and General Zhadov of the 5th Ukrainian armies. Another great American soldier of the Second World War, General MacArthur, was given a fantastic reception when he arrived in New York after a triumphal journey halfway around the world from Japan. In 1942, he was given command of the United Nations armies in the Southwest Pacific, and in the autumn began an offensive which he never relinquished until New Guinea was conquered and the Philippines liberated. And so New York went to town to give MacArthur a tremendous welcome on his return to his country after an absence of many years. And the ticker tape showered down on him in a blizzard of paper. As an army commander, he was a worldwide popular hero. But as the post-war administrator of Japan, he became involved in political questions and in Korea became even more open to criticism for his policies. But on this day, America remembered only his stupendous war record. Just before this day in 1948, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth celebrated their silver wedding. Along the familiar procession route, crowds gathered for a day of national rejoicing and thanksgiving. 25 years had passed since the royal prince had married his Scottish bride. Together they had given a quarter of a century of service to their people. At Temple Bar, the Lord Mayor presented the king with the ceremonial sword, granting the sovereign the right to enter the city. Scenes like these have often been filmed, and thousands of emotional words have described the traditional pageantry and enthusiasm of the people for the royal family. The absolute security and popularity of the British monarchy still remains a phenomenon of this chaotic 20th century. And here was one of the occasions when the popularity of British royalty was demonstrated to the world in the greeting given to every one of the family. Queen Mary with the Earl of Athlone, the Duchess of Kent and her children, the Gloucesters, the Duke and Duchess and young Prince William. Behind follow the King's ministers, Herbert Morrison, Ernest Bevin, the Prime Minister and Mrs. Attlee, Mr. and Mrs. Churchill. As the family returned to their home, it seemed as if the whole nation had come to wish them well. A great crowd surged across from the Victoria Memorial to the railings round the forecourt of Buckingham Palace in a spontaneous demonstration of their affection and loyalty. For a short time, economic crisis and Cold War were forgotten in a great family celebration on this day in 1948.